So the survival potential for organism species, the range of tolerance. So this is the stuff we're talking about. I'm going to actually skip down to limiting factors first here. A limiting factor is any factor, biotic or abiotic, that limits the growth of an organism. So I've listed some examples in your notes here. So weather can be a limiting factor. Included under that could be like temperature, precipitation, wind movement, anything like that. Okay. Food, the amount, the type, competition for it, water, living space, invading or alien species coming in. So any of these things can impact the growth of an organism. And remember, when we say organism, we're not talking just animals. We're talking plants, animals, any living thing. Okay, now, so the range of tolerance and all this other stuff has to do with limiting factors and how the limiting factors affect an organism. So what I've done here is I've given and I'll put this up too online once I get it drawn out here. But I've got essentially what's going to be sort of it's not really a timeline. It's a range of tolerance line here. And then I've got the limiting factor information down here, what it is. But so a range of tolerance is a range of environmental conditions within which an organism or species is capable of survival and growth. So within this, you've got what's considered a range of tolerance. Okay, so in here, is our range of tolerance. Now, this is about a limiting factor. So let's take something easy to think about, like temperature for certain plants, right? You wouldn't buy and put certain plants and like plant certain plants here in northern Illinois because they can't handle the cold winters. It would kill them off, right? Like a tropical plant or something like that. So and that's because the plants have a range of tolerance, like a range of temperatures that they can tolerate from high to low. Like if it got really super hot, a lot of plants can't handle that too and burn them up, right? So there's a range of tolerance, and if you've ever seen, I don't know if a lot of people do this these days, but maybe your parents do or something. But if you've ever seen, I don't know exactly I forget what they're called, hardiness zone. So let's see if I can. Okay, so so this is a hardiness zone map, and what it is it's like different ranges. It's different ranges of temperatures that occur in those areas, and then they like rate plants and stuff by those zones. So like if you look at us, I wish it wouldn't zoom in so far, but all right. Um, so if you look at us here in Illinois, um, we've got green, light blue, and like that sort of medium blue. So if you look over here, come on, there we go. So the green, the light blue, and so basically, and up where we were was kind of like light blue and that medium blue. So these are what they are is generically the temperature ranges that it falls into. Now this is the lower edge, not the higher edge, but basically if you look, it says negative 15 to like negative 10 to negative 20 is 5A and 5B together. So basically what that means is that's the lowest temperature that it hits, and if the plants can withstand that, you're okay to buy them and plant them. But if they can't, so like if you have a plant that's rated like say an 8A, meaning it can only handle 10 to 15 degrees is the lowest it can handle. You don't want to buy that and plant that up here by us because our winters will kill it. It's outside, and so that goes back to this idea that would be outside of its range of tolerance. The range of tolerance is whatever the limiting factor is. If it's temperature, if it's amount of water, if it's the amount of living space, whatever the limiting factor you're talking about, it has a range of tolerance that it can handle. And so from on the low end to the high end. Now, these little red lines here would be the limits of tolerance. Okay. So you would have a high and a low limit of tolerance. What do you think a limit of tolerance means? Or let me ask it to you this way. What do you think happens if the limiting factor goes above or below the range of the limit of tolerance? Sure, anything. Yeah, both ways, exactly. Yep. So down here, death is likely. Same thing above here. Death likely. Okay. If whatever the limiting factor is, so again, if we're talking about temperature, if the temperature goes below or above the limit of tolerance for that organism, for that species or whatever, it's most likely that the organism is going to die. Because the limit of tolerance is literally kind of what it sounds like. It's the limit to what that organism can tolerate or handle. If it goes past that limit, it's something that it probably can't handle, or at least not handle for any length of time. Okay. So limits of tolerance, the high and low ends points of the range of tolerance where conditions beyond are unfavorable for survival and growth. Okay, then we have what is referred to as the optimal range. So the optimal range is the area somewhere in the middle. Okay, so out here you've got death likely. right? The optimal range is somewhere in the middle where the conditions, as it says in your notes here, the conditions are best suited for the organism or species to survive and grow. It's the area where the species or organism will thrive. So that's like whatever the limiting factor you're talking about, that's the range where it's like the best for it. Okay, so again, if you're talking temperature for a plant, it's whatever temperature leads to the best growth of it. Think about if you guys have ever seen um, like for fish, right? Like you've got things that you've got to monitor for your fish tank, like water temperature, like pH level, stuff like that. And you want to keep it in a certain range, right? That it's best for it to survive and grow. That would be another example of, you have an optimal range, and then you also have a range where you're likely to kill the fish if it gets outside of that. Okay? So then the third part of this is what are called zones of stress. It's areas between the optimal range and the limits of tolerance where the further the conditions get from the optimal range, survival and growth becomes increasingly difficult. So we have here the zones of stress. The zones of stress. And as it says, so think about um, think about you guys and like doing work and having like a bunch of different things to do. So say you have you start the week off or whatever, and you've got everything caught up, and you're like, okay, so Monday comes along, and you're like, and you've got a couple of things. You say you get a couple of homework assignments to work on or whatever. No big deal. You're probably, you got a little bit of stress, but not a ton. But then as the week goes on, you've got a paper now all of a sudden that's due on Friday. You've got a test that's due on Friday, and you find out that you're on you've got work and you've got a work schedule. You've got to work 2 days that week, and your parents want you to be home to watch a little sibling on one day, and you just have all these things that start adding up, right? So what happens the more and more things that sort of piled on your plate? Yeah, you get more stressed, right? And like in general, it doesn't mean you can't be successful, but the more stress you get, the more things you have on your plate, the overall more difficult it is to function and get everything done, right? Like you just got more and more to do and to worry about and to try to manage and take care of, right? Well, that's kind of the same as here, except it's not like a bunch of other things added to it. It's just the idea of they've got this optimal range for the limiting factor, wherever it's the best. As you get further away from that, it gets harder to survive, grow, thrive, reproduce. So the zones of stress, they're still okay, but like the further you get away from the optimal range and the closer to the limit, the more challenging it's becoming for that organism to survive whatever that limiting factor is. Okay, doesn't mean they can't. It's just not as good as it were if it were in the optimal range. So your book shows this. It's sort of I forget what the term is, like cladogram or something. It shows an example of this. Where is it? Here you go. So your book shows this example with plants and relating it to temperature for this as well. So I'm holding it kind of at an angle to hopefully reduce the glare, but so you can see so this is showing like the rate of growth. I'm actually showing it with plants here, but basically what you see is that it gets the best growth here in this range. So you get the most growth in the range between, looks like, what are these, every 2 degrees? So like between 20 and 30-ish, somewhere in there is where it gets the best growth. That's the optimal range. And then you can see as you go further from the center out with increasing stress, these zones of stress, as you get further from that optimal range, the growth gets more and more difficult until you get past the limit of tolerance where death is very likely to occur. Okay. So, all right. So just remember, the one thing that's important to remember is that this whole thing about range of tolerance, limits of tolerance, zones of stress, optimal range, all of this is talking about limiting factors. It can be, you can do this for any factor that would potentially limit the growth of an organism. Okay, so all those examples, you can do it for any of these things. You could do a range of tolerance idea for that. Okay. I'm thinking like another example. I tend to think about plants, but you can think also. I give you the fish example. If any of you have ever had like amphibians or reptiles as like pets or know anybody that does, like they've got certain temperatures they need to stay in because they can't self-regulate their body temp, right? Like they can't get too cold or too hot type of idea. Um, so that would be a similar example. Um, all right. Any questions about any of those terms or any of this? Okay. Like I said, I'll put a copy of this up on, I know I've already put up the assignment, but I'll put a copy of this up with it as well, so you kind of have this to look back on. Okay, the last thing on here is synergistic effects or synergisms. This is the combining of two or more limiting factors, which increases the impact's effect, making it greater than would normally be expected from each of the factors acting separately. So, for example, pollutants acting in a way that causes organisms to become more vulnerable to disease or drought than it would be normally by itself. Okay. The best sort of analogy I can use for that, the synergistic effects or synergisms, is if you've ever heard, like sometimes they'll talk about like sports teams, and they'll talk about a sport team that sort of overachieves. And it's like if you look at any one person in any position on that sports team, you wouldn't say necessarily that they're like a superstar, this or that. But for some reason, the sum of the parts is greater than the individuals. Like the way they work together, whatever, it just makes them a better team than you would think that they would be individually if you would look at it, right? And that's kind of what synergistic effects are. It's when you put two or more factors together, and it sort of ramps up more than they would the effect of them more than it would be if you looked at them individually. Okay. All right. So, any questions on any of that information? Okay.